Hey everybody, this is Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex, back again here at the Atrium in the World Bank. It's gotten quite a bit quieter behind us, but previously today there was a buzz going on. And it's been an exciting few days and lots of conversations happening at the World Bank, spring meetings here. And one kind of underlying theme is the rise of conflict around the world. The number of humanitarian crises, that they're protracted, they're prolonged. And it's not that clear what to do about many of these cases. Many of them are really tough. Maybe the toughest in the world is Yemen. And we've got Achim Steiner here with us. He's the administrator of the UN Development Program, which is playing a key role in Yemen and in a lot of the humanitarian crises around the world. Actually has a close partnership with the World Bank in Yemen. So I thought while we have a few minutes with you, we can just focus on Yemen first.
Sure.
Tell us, what is the situation there and what are you and the World Bank doing about it?
Well, thanks, Raj, for having me. And I think very appropriate that in the context of the annual meetings of the World Bank here, or the spring meetings, we should talk about a country such as Yemen, because one way to summarize the situation is desperate, tragic. At the moment, the United Nations considers Yemen the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. In a population of 24 million people, 80% are in need of assistance. But you know, it's not just a humanitarian crisis, it's a developmental tragedy, because this is really the story behind the immediate response to conflict, which is that you're losing years, decades of development institutions, development infrastructure. You are condemning a generation to not having access to proper health care, to no education. So behind the humanitarian crisis is a development tragedy unfolding. And so what the World Bank and what the UN and UNDP in this particular case have been trying to do is to find a way in which the financing of development funds that usually are available to a country like Yemen, but then are frozen in moments of crisis and conflict, are made available to, first of all, stabilize institutions, maybe keep schools open, health stations functioning, and secondly, try and help the population to maintain at least a minimum capacity to live, to earn some money, to feed and buy food for their families. And this is what, with $300 million, the bank has brought with UNDP, literally into every district in Yemen right now. In one sense, it's a drop on the hot stone. On the other hand, you know, when you have virtually nothing, the impact of these $300 million have been phenomenal. 350,000 people have actually had a chance to get employment. If you take the household, family household, 2.8, 2.6 million people better off in the sense of being able to buy some food. Thousands of schools rehabilitated, small grants given to women to enable them to perhaps undertake small businesses just to stay alive. So, to cut a long story short, it's a tragedy, it's a crisis, it's desperate, but beyond the humanitarian response, we can actually do something at least to already maintain perhaps an element of that which is currently being lost, and for when the crisis, the conflict is over, a more rapid recovery becomes at least potentially possible.
Right, I think one thing that's maybe a legacy of the old world is that we have a humanitarian system which is quite separate from the development system. So what's quite unusual about this example is that the World Bank, which is a hallmark of the development community and industry, is connecting now with an organization doing humanitarian work. And that silo that has existed, that wall between humanitarian and development, people have been talking for over a decade about breaking it down, that these crises are getting longer. But it sounds like maybe that's actually beginning to happen, that we're beginning to change the way we work. What do you think?
Yes, and I think it is common sense. I mean, the origins of humanitarian intervention and development interventions were obviously partly historical, partly different budget lines, partly also different bases upon which the international community could support. But over time, they've also become barriers to intelligent interaction, to working together. UNDP is a development organization, the bank is a development organization, but together with our colleagues also in the World Food Programme, UNICEF, UNHCR, for instance, we are working in this, what has been called a new way of working, trying to find ways in which intelligent collaboration and joint deployment allow you to provide, on the one hand, the humanitarian assistance, which is about saving lives now, tomorrow, and at the same time not simply sitting back and watching the developmental assets just implode and disappear. So we are, in a sense, intervening earlier in order to be able to more effectively deploy development and recovery work later. And similarly for the humanitarian intervention, this provides a bridge from the mere delivery of, a food ration or a medical kit, to actually seeing people have a chance to maybe, in a minimal level, rebuild their livelihoods.
Yeah, if you think about the basic challenges in a humanitarian crisis, of course there's getting food, getting clean water. But very soon after that, it's livelihood. How do I make a living? It's housing. I think there's 3 million displaced people internally within Yemen.
Absolutely.
Where do they stay? Those basic needs are humanitarian in a sense, but they also connect very much to the way the development system works and what it's geared to do.
Absolutely. And right now, let me also mention this, that we are already facing funding shortages again for the humanitarian response in Yemen. I just want to remind people, when the Syrian crisis broke out, just some years ago, we paid a very heavy price for then having not found the resources in the international community to support people in the refugee camps. So the World Food Programme had to cut rations. The WHO had to shut down health posts. UNICEF, UNESCO could not run the schools in the refugee camps. When people cannot provide these fundamentals to their families, their children, they have no option but to leave.
But to leave. The migration pressure was huge.
Precisely. And so this is why working in this more intelligent, more joined up way is both needed, and I think it produces real dividends for people on the ground in the midst of a crisis.
Now, what does it mean for your institution, for the UN Development Program? As you said, you're a development organization, but you're a little unique in that you wear the UN hat. You're all over the world, and get 170 countries, and increasingly people are turning to you because of that footprint to work in the most challenging circumstances in places like Yemen. So what is that going to mean for UNDP going forward?
Well, sadly, that we have to, first of all, invest far more money in helping people to not lose the development gains that they have managed to acquire over time. When we published the Human Development Report Index in 2018, what was quite evident is that most of the countries which slid down in the Human Development Index, where poverty became more prevalent, were all countries in conflict, in crisis settings. So conflict is a terrible poverty multiplier. Self-evident in one sense, but often forgotten. So for UNDP, that is committed to poverty eradication, which has a central role to help countries, governments, communities to actually help people escape from poverty, being there and being active in the midst of the worst poverty increasing drivers is a logical step to do, and to do so as part of the UN presence. And I think we are very proud that we work as part of the United Nations family, and very often people, I think, in the world underestimate how many people every day have something to eat, stay alive, are protected in a refugee camp, or are provided with basic medical support or vaccinations, because our colleagues are working on the front lines of conflict, where humanitarian assistance and development support make all the difference between either having nothing or having something to hold on to. And UNDP belongs into that world, because this is, our strength to be present in countries, often for decades already, as a partner, and as one would say, sometimes through thick and thin.
Right. Let me ask you just one more question before we have to wrap up. Because you get to see such a variety of countries, you're right, conflict is a big driver of increased poverty, of countries slipping down the index. Do you see kind of an operating theory for why conflict is on the rise, and that in a way that connects back to the same development issues that UNDP normally works on?
It's a very good question, and every conflict has its own very unique drivers, but in our age, what is quite obvious is that it's very often a governance failure. We have competing demands, we have competing needs, and sometimes we divide ourselves along religious lines or ethnic lines or geographical lines, and very quickly when a government, when the state cannot exercise its governance function, which is to ensure fairness, equitable access, protect the fundamental rights of its citizens, conflicts very often have the space in which they can expand, where people start manipulating perhaps this sense of unfairness. And I think this is often at the root of most conflicts. And so the work that UNDP has so centrally written into its DNA, help to build institutions, governance capacity, the rule of law, the fundamental human rights, alongside the economic and social and sustainability dimensions of development, I think speak to the core reason why development failures often can explain the escalation of conflicts, and why development success very often demonstrates what happens when you get it right.
Right.
And this is and continues to be a centerpiece of the work of UNDP in the year 2019.
It's such an important point, and it's a good reason why we need to continue to invest in development efforts as almost a humanitarian effort in itself, right? That these are not two separate things, they really are together.
Absolutely, and you know, often people today question whether development works, whether we are failing. You know, it's sometimes worth reminding ourselves that 250 years ago, 9 out of 10 people alive on this planet, there were fewer then, lived in extreme poverty.
That's right.
Today it's less than 1.
Yeah.
Development can work. Societies every day prove that when they get it right, it actually can be a tremendous liberator.
That's right.
As Ahmad Hassan used to refer to it, development is freedom.
That's right.
And I think where we fail, we should not give up. We should ask ourselves, why are these failures happening time and again? And from there, we often come back to the fundamentals of governance, of transparency, and of leadership also.
That's right. We don't even have to go back 250 years. Just 40 years ago, it was basically 4 in 10 people who were living in extreme poverty. It's down to 1. That's still far too many. It's still almost 800 million people in the world. But it's a really important moment that we get right around humanitarian development, conflict. So this is something DevEx has been covering a lot. We are going to continue to cover your work at UNDP. Thank you for taking some time to discuss it with us today at the World Bank Spring
Thank you
Meetings.
for having me, Raj. Pleasure.
Thanks.